The Persian scout adjusted his position on the rocky outcrop, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the cool mountain air. His name was Artaphernes, a seasoned cavalry officer who had witnessed the conquest of Egypt, the subjugation of Babylon, and the burning of Sardis. He had seen armies flee at the mere sight of Persian banners, watched kings prostrate themselves before the great king's throne, and observed the terror in men's eyes when they realized their world was ending. Yet nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was witnessing in the narrow pass of Thermopylae below. King Xerxes had dispatched him with explicit instructions: observe the Greeks, count their numbers, assess their preparations, and report back on their state of mind. The Persian emperor expected to find panic, chaos, desperate prayers to their gods, or perhaps the Greeks already fled into the mountains. After all, word of the massive Persian army had traveled ahead like wildfire. Stories of a force so vast it drank rivers dry and darkened the sky with arrows. Any rational commander would have abandoned this hopeless position days ago. Instead, what Artaphernes witnessed made his blood run cold, not from fear, but from sheer bewilderment that challenged everything he understood about human nature in the face of imminent death. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of ancient warfare, you'll want to witness what comes next, because this scene would redefine what it meant to be a warrior. 300 Spartan warriors moved through the Greek camp with an almost supernatural calm, their movements precise and deliberate as priests performing a sacred ritual. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pass, illuminating scenes that seemed to exist outside the normal laws of human behavior. Some of these legendary warriors performed naked exercises, their bronze-hard muscles rippling under the Mediterranean sun, their bodies bearing the scars of countless battles and the systematic brutality of their training. But it wasn't their physical prowess that struck the scout speechless. It was what the others were doing. Sitting in perfect rows along the ancient stone wall that blocked the pass, these men who were about to face the largest army ever assembled were methodically combing their long hair, with an attention to detail that seemed not just absurd, but almost insane for warriors preparing to meet certain death. Each movement was deliberate, practiced, reverent. Bronze combs moved through auburn and black locks with the precision of craftsmen creating their masterpiece. Some warriors braided elaborate patterns, others simply ensured every strand fell perfectly into place. The sight was so surreal that Artaphernes found himself wondering if he was witnessing some form of madness brought on by terror. The scout observed them carefully for over an hour, marveling at the sight, noting their numbers, studying their equipment, trying to understand what he was seeing. Not once did any Greek show concern for his presence. No one pursued him or paid him attention when he moved to different vantage points. It was as if they existed in a different world, one where the approaching storm of Persian might was merely a distant concern compared to the proper arrangement of their hair. When Artaphernes finally rode back to deliver his report to the most powerful man on earth, his mind struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the ravings of a fever dream. The Persian camp sprawled across the landscape like a city. Thousands of tents arranged in perfect geometric patterns, banners from dozens of nations fluttering in the breeze, the constant sound of hammering as engineers assembled siege equipment, and everywhere the movement of humanity on a scale that defied comprehension. At the center of this organized chaos sat Xerxes in his golden pavilion, surrounded by the most skilled generals, advisors, and courtiers from across the known world. When the scout recounted what he had seen, warriors combing their hair as if preparing for a wedding rather than a slaughter, the King of Kings burst into laughter that echoed through the tent. Surely this was some kind of elaborate joke. Warriors preparing for battle by grooming themselves. The laughter spread through the assembled Persian nobility like ripples on a pond. These Greeks, they concluded, had clearly lost their minds with terror. Perhaps they thought that if they looked presentable, they might be spared when the inevitable surrender came. Or maybe this was some barbaric ritual designed to appease their primitive gods. The Persians had encountered many strange customs in their conquest of the world, but nothing quite as bizarre as warriors treating their final morning like a visit to the marketplace. But the laughter died in Xerxes' throat when Demaratus stepped forward. The exiled Spartan king, who had found refuge at the Persian court after political machinations had driven him from his homeland, carried himself with a dignity that commanded respect even from his former enemies. His weathered face bore the distinctive scars that marked all Spartan warriors. Thin white lines across his forehead from the brutal training that had begun in childhood, deeper marks on his arms from real combat, and in his eyes, something that the Persians had learned to recognize and fear, the absolute certainty of a man who had never learned to doubt himself. When these men are about to risk their lives, Demaratus explained solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, it is their custom to adorn their hair. They prepare themselves as carefully for death as other men prepare for their wedding day. The former king's words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread through the tent. You have before you the bravest men in Greece. More than that, you face warriors who have made peace with their own death. The morning mist began to lift from the pass, revealing the impossible odds that would define this confrontation. Behind Xerxes stretched an army that Herodotus would later describe as so vast it drank rivers dry. Over 100,000 warriors from 46 different nations, each bringing their own weapons, tactics, and traditions of warfare. Assyrians with brass helmets and iron clubs marched alongside Scythian archers with their deadly composite bows. Indian charioteers rattled past Thracian horsemen, and through it all moved the elite core of Persian power, the 10,000 immortals, so named because whenever one fell, another immediately took his place, maintaining their number in an endless cycle of replaceable death. Against this human tsunami stood 7,000 Greeks, and even that number was deceptive. Most were militia from small city-states, farmers and craftsmen who had answered the call to defend their homeland, but who lacked the professional training that characterized true soldiers. At their heart stood just 300 Spartans, but these weren't ordinary warriors. These were the products of the most brutal and effective military training system the world had ever devised. Men who had been shaped from childhood into living weapons that knew no fear, because they had been systematically stripped of everything except the will to fight and die for their state. Yet, as the Persian scout had witnessed, these warriors showed no trace of the terror that should have consumed rational men facing such odds. No frantic checking of weapons, no desperate prayers to distant gods, no final letters to wives and children. Instead, they performed their hair-grooming ritual with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else, from the brutal training that had forged them since childhood, to the battles that had made their reputation legendary across the Mediterranean world. The sight was more than strange. It was profoundly unnerving, suggesting a mindset so alien to normal human experience that even experienced warriors like Demaratus struggled to explain it to outsiders. The same morning, Greek camp king Leonidas moved through his men like a general inspecting not soldiers preparing for slaughter, but participants in a sacred ceremony that would echo through history. At 60 years old, the Spartan king carried himself with the bearing of a man who had already transcended mortal concerns. His own long hair, now silver-streaked and braided with intricate patterns that spoke of his royal lineage, gleamed in the morning sun like burnished metal. Every strand was perfectly placed, every braid a small work of art that had taken his personal attendant nearly an hour to complete. This wasn't vanity. This was something far more profound and terrifying. The king paused beside a young warrior named Alpheus, barely 20 years old, but already bearing the scars that marked him as a veteran of border skirmishes with Messenia. The young man's hands moved with practiced precision through his long auburn hair, separating it into sections that would be woven into a battle braid designed to fit perfectly under his bronze helmet. His movements had the meditative quality of a religious ritual, each gesture performed with reverence and absolute attention to detail. "Tell me, Alpheus," Leonidas said quietly, "what do you think the Persians see when they look at us?" The young warrior didn't pause in his grooming as he answered, "They see madmen, my king. Men so consumed by terror that we've lost the ability to prepare for battle properly." Leonidas smiled, an expression that transformed his scarred face into something almost gentle. "And what do you see when you look at yourself in your shield's reflection?" Alpheus set down his bronze comb and lifted his polished shield, studying his face in its mirror-bright surface. His hair now fell in perfect waves to his shoulders, each strand catching the light like spun gold. Despite his youth, His eyes held the calm certainty that marked all Spartan warriors who had completed the agoge. "I see a man preparing to meet the gods as an equal, my king." The later Greek historian Xenophon would write that the legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus permitted men who were past their first youth to wear long hair, believing that it would make them look taller, more dignified, and more terrifying. But the ritual the Persians witnessed went deeper than mere intimidation tactics or battlefield psychology. The Spartans weren't trying to frighten their enemies with their appearance. They were preparing their souls for the ultimate transition from mortal life to heroic immortality. The philosophical foundation for this practice lay buried in the deepest levels of Spartan culture, traceable back to the reforms of Lycurgus himself. According to tradition, the legendary lawgiver had studied the customs of other lands before returning to transform Sparta into something unique in the Greek world. He had observed that most warriors approached death with fear, seeing it as the end of everything they valued. The Spartans would be different. They would approach death as the culmination of everything they had trained for. When these men are about to leave their lives, the explanation that Demaratus had given to Xerxes captured only the surface of a much deeper philosophy. They first make their heads beautiful. This wasn't preparation for battle in any conventional sense. This was preparation for apotheosis, the transformation from mortal warrior to eternal hero, conducted with the same deliberate care a priest might use to prepare the most sacred religious offering. The hair grooming ritual served multiple psychological functions that made the Spartans nearly invincible in combat, but understanding these functions required understanding the Spartan conception of courage itself. In most armies, courage was an emotion, fear overcome by anger, desperation, loyalty to comrades, or hope for victory. Spartan courage was something entirely different. It was not a feeling but a habit, not an emotional state, but a technical skill developed through decades of training and reinforced through ritual. First, the ritual demonstrated supreme confidence that bordered on contempt for their enemies. While the Persian army rushed about in frantic preparation, checking weapons and armor repeatedly, organizing supply lines, conducting final strategy sessions, the Spartans invested precious time in what seemed like trivialities. The message was unmistakable. We are so certain of our training, our tactics, and our cause that we have time for personal grooming. More than confidence, it was a form of psychological warfare that didn't rely on threats or displays of strength, but on the far more unnerving demonstration of complete calm in the face of overwhelming danger. Second, the ritual created an almost meditative state that allowed warriors to function at peak efficiency despite the chaos of battle. Modern soldiers might recognize this as similar to the pre-mission rituals performed by elite special forces, repetitive, familiar actions that calm the mind and focus attention. But the Spartan ritual went deeper, creating what their culture called ataraxia, perfect tranquility of mind. As they methodically worked through their hair with bronze combs, each warrior entered a mental space where fear, doubt, and even hope ceased to exist. What remained was pure function, the human machine operating at its designed capacity. The psychological impact on enemies was devastating, but it wasn't the primary purpose. The Spartans weren't performing for the Persians, they were performing for themselves, for their gods, and for the generations who would inherit their legacy. When word spread through the Persian ranks that the enemy was spending the morning combing their hair, it created a ripple of unease that no amount of numerical superiority could dispel. These weren't warriors desperately trying to survive. These were men who had already accepted death and found it beautiful. The concept of beautiful death, kalos thanatos, was central to Spartan culture in ways that modern minds struggle to comprehend. In their worldview, physical beauty and moral excellence were inseparable, two aspects of the same divine principle. A warrior who died beautifully died well. The careful grooming wasn't about attracting women, impressing peers, or intimidating enemies. It was about honoring the gods and ensuring that when their souls departed their bodies, they did so from vessels worthy of their sacrifice. Plutarch would later write that the Spartans relaxed the harshest elements of the young men's training during wartime, allowing them to groom their hair and decorate their weapons, pleased at the sight of them like horses prancing and neighing before a contest. The comparison to horses wasn't accidental. In Greek culture, horses represented the perfect fusion of power and beauty, strength and grace. The groomed Spartan warrior embodied the same ideal. a creature of terrible beauty, dangerous precisely because it had transcended ordinary human limitations. As the sun climbed higher and the sounds of the approaching Persian army grew louder, Leonidas addressed his men as they ate their breakfast. Not the elaborate meal that warriors might consume before an uncertain battle, but simple bread, cheese, and wine taken with the casual appetite of men who knew exactly how their day would end. "Have a good breakfast, men," the king announced with a smile that was both gentle and terrible. "For tonight we dine in Hades." They cheered him, not with the desperate enthusiasm of men trying to convince themselves they might survive, but with the genuine joy of warriors who had found their perfect moment. Their long hair gleamed in the morning light, each strand precisely placed, each braid a small work of art that would soon be scattered across the rocks of Thermopylae. They had achieved something that eluded most mortals. They had made death not just acceptable, but beautiful. If this video has opened your eyes to the deeper truths behind ancient warfare, imagine what other secrets wait to be discovered. Be sure to subscribe for more revelations from the ancient world. Hours before the final battle, the third day, the betrayal had come, as betrayals often do, from one who valued gold over honor, comfort over principle, personal gain over the survival of his people. Ephialtes was his name, a local Greek who knew the mountain paths around Thermopylae as well as he knew the lines on his own palm. For months, perhaps years, he had watched the narrow pass and dreamed of the reward that might come from the right piece of information delivered to the right buyer. When the Persian army arrived with its glittering promise of Persian gold, Ephialtes found his moment. The mountain path he revealed to Xerxes was called the Anapaia, a treacherous route that snaked through the heights above Thermopylae, known only to locals who used it to move sheep and goats between pastures. It would allow a force of Persian soldiers to circle behind the Greek defenders, attacking them from the rear while the main army pressed from the front. The tactical situation would become hopeless. The Greeks would be caught between two forces with no possibility of retreat. When Persian scouts confirmed the existence of the path and its viability for moving troops, Xerxes made his decision with the cold calculation that had built the largest empire in human history. He detached a force of his elite immortals under the command of Hydarnes, a general who had never failed in an assignment. They would march through the night, reach the far end of the pass by dawn, and attack the Greeks from behind. The trap would close like the jaws of a great beast, and the troublesome resistance at Thermopylae would finally be crushed. Word of the Persian flanking movement reached the Greeks through their own network of scouts and lookouts posted in the mountains. The intelligence arrived in stages throughout the night, each report confirming what military logic had always suggested. The position at Thermopylae was ultimately indefensible against an enemy with unlimited resources and local knowledge. In any other army, this news would have triggered panic, recriminations, desperate tactical discussions, and probably immediate retreat. The Spartans received the intelligence with the same calm they had shown all week. The young officer who brought the final confirmation found King Leonidas sitting on a flat stone, methodically working oil through his hair, while his personal attendant prepared the complex braids that would fit under his helmet. The king listened to the report without changing expression, asked 3 precise questions about timing and enemy numbers, then nodded dismissively. "Thank you, Pantites," Leonidas said to the messenger. "Now go and prepare yourself. Dawn will bring interesting work." Leonidas called a war council, gathering the leaders of all the Greek contingents around a small fire as the stars wheeled overhead. The discussion was brief and to the point, military professionals assessing a tactical situation that had become untenable. The Phocians who had been guarding the mountain path had been scattered by the Persian attack. Enemy forces would reach the rear of the Greek position within hours. The wise course, the only rational course, was immediate retreat while the route south remained open. Most of the Greek leaders agreed. They had done their job. They had delayed the Persian advance for 3 precious days, allowing the Greek fleet to withdraw from nearby Artemisium, and giving the southern city-states time to complete their defensive preparations. There was no shame in tactical withdrawal when faced with impossible odds. They could regroup, fight again when the conditions were more favorable, preserve their forces for battles that might actually be won. But when the council looked to Leonidas for his decision, the Spartan king's response cut through their careful military logic like a blade through silk. "The rest of you may go. he said quietly. Sparta will remain. The philosophical foundation for this decision ran deeper than tactics or strategy, deeper even than the prophetic words of the oracle at Delphi that had haunted Leonidas since before the march north. Either your famed great town must be sacked by Perseus' sons, or if that be not, the whole land of Lacedaemon shall mourn the death of a king of the house of Heracles. The oracle had made the choice stark. Either Sparta falls, or a Spartan king dies. For Leonidas, trained from boyhood to put the state above all personal considerations, there had never been any choice at all. But it went beyond even that divine mandate. The Spartans had come to Thermopylae not just to fight a battle, but to demonstrate something essential about human nature. That there were principles more important than survival, ideals worth dying for, and ways of facing death that could transform defeat into a victory that would echo through the ages. To retreat now, however militarily sensible, would betray everything they represented. As the majority of the Greek army began their withdrawal south, moving through the darkness with the quiet efficiency of professional soldiers, executing a difficult but necessary maneuver, Leonidas and his 300 Spartans remained in position. They were joined by 700 Thespians under Demophilus, who refused to abandon their Spartan allies, and 400 Thebans whose loyalty was questionable but whose presence served Leonidas's purposes. With these forces, plus an unknown number of Helots who served as attendants and support troops, the Spartan king would make his stand. That final night, the remaining warriors performed their grooming ritual with even greater ceremony than before. They had moved beyond the practical considerations of battle preparation and entered the realm of sacred theater. The Spartans spent the evening in a collective embrace of the morning yet to come, for they knew they were expected to die as they combed each other's hair, oiled their bodies, and prepared for what would be their final day. This communal grooming served to transform individual warriors into something larger, a single organism dedicated to an ideal that transcended personal survival. Master and student, veteran and recruit, king and common soldier, all participated equally in the ritual preparation. Older warriors shared techniques for elaborate braiding that had been passed down through generations, while younger men demonstrated new variations they had developed during their years in the barracks. The oil they used wasn't ordinary olive oil, but a specially prepared mixture that included herbs sacred to Apollo and Artemis, the twin deities who were patron gods of Sparta. As they worked the fragrant oil through their hair, the warriors weren't just grooming themselves. They were making offerings to the gods, transforming their bodies into sacred vessels worthy of divine attention. The sweet scent filled the night air, mixing with the smoke from their fires and the salt tang of the nearby sea to create an atmosphere that was both military camp and religious sanctuary. The psychological effect of this final preparation was profound, both on the warriors themselves and on their enemies. The Persians, watching from their camps across the pass, could see the Greeks moving about with the same methodical care they had shown all week. No frantic activity, no desperate strategizing, no pleas to the gods for deliverance, no final letters to wives and children. Just warriors making themselves beautiful for death with the same attention to detail they had always applied to their appearance. For the Spartans themselves, the grooming ritual served as a final meditation on the meaning of their lives and the manner of their deaths. As they worked through their hair, they reflected on the boys they had been when they first entered the agoge, the training that had shaped them, the battles they had fought, the honor they had earned, and the legend they were about to create. This wasn't melancholy or regret. It was a form of spiritual accounting, a final assessment of a life lived according to principles that most men could barely comprehend. Plutarch would later write that the Spartans relaxed the harshest elements of the young men's training during wartime, allowing them to groom their hair and decorate their weapons, pleased at the sight of them like horses prancing and neighing before a contest. But this wasn't mere decoration or psychological preparation, it was transformation. Through their grooming ritual, these men stepped outside ordinary human concerns and entered a sacred space where death lost its terror and became instead the culmination of everything they had lived for. When dawn broke on the third day, painting the sky the color of blood and gold, Leonidas watched his faithful Spartan bodyguards eat their morning meal and comb their hair one final time. The ritual had evolved over the 3 days of battle, becoming more elaborate and ceremonial with each repetition. Now it reached its ultimate expression. Not just preparation for battle, but preparation for apotheosis, the transformation from mortal warriors to eternal heroes. "Have a good breakfast, men," the king told them, his voice carrying easily through the morning air. "For tonight we dine in Hades." The words weren't spoken with grim determination or false bravado, but with genuine anticipation. In the Spartan worldview, death in battle wasn't an ending but a promotion, a chance to join the heroes of previous generations in the eternal feast of the blessed dead. They donned their fierce Corinthian helmets, bronze masterworks that covered their faces completely except for eye holes and a narrow slit for the mouth. The helmets transformed them from individual men into anonymous instruments of war, identical and terrifying. They strapped on their great shields, the bronze-faced aspides that were the tools of their trade and the symbols of their honor. The Spartan mother's command echoed in every mind. "Return with your shield or on it." As they marched toward the western narrows of the pass for the final time, their perfectly groomed hair hidden now beneath bronze and horsehair crests, they moved with the measured pace of men walking to a wedding rather than a slaughter. Behind them, Xerxes poured libations to his gods and prepared to witness the destruction of the most troublesome obstacle his empire had ever encountered. The final irony was that the Spartan hair grooming ritual, intended as preparation for beautiful death, became itself a source of immortal beauty. When Herodotus, Plutarch, and other historians recorded the events at Thermopylae, they devoted careful attention to this seemingly trivial detail because they recognized its profound significance. The image of warriors calmly combing their hair while preparing to face impossible odds became one of the most powerful symbols in Western literature, representing the triumph of human dignity over mere survival. The epitaph composed by Simonides, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie," distilled the Spartan ideal of duty and sacrifice into its purest form. But it was the image of their final grooming ritual that gave that epitaph its emotional power. These weren't men who had been surprised by death or overwhelmed by superior force. These were warriors who had chosen their fate and prepared for it with the same meticulous care they brought to every aspect of their lives. Their carefully groomed corpses, scattered across the narrow pass of Thermopylae, became the foundation of a legend that would inspire warriors for over 2 millennia. From Roman centurions to medieval knights, from Renaissance soldiers to modern special forces, warriors would remember the Spartans who combed their hair before walking into certain death, and find in that image a standard of courage that transcended mere battlefield success. The terrifying truth behind the Spartan grooming ritual wasn't that they ignored death. It was that they had made death beautiful. In combing their hair with such care before battle, they transformed the ultimate human fear into the ultimate human art. They had discovered that the only way to truly defeat death was to welcome it so completely that it became not an ending, but a masterpiece of human will expressed in bronze and blood and perfectly arranged hair. When Xerxes finally broke through the pass and found Leonidas's body among the scattered Greek dead, he had the Spartan king's head struck off and mounted on a stake, a desecration that spoke to the Persian emperor's rage and perhaps his recognition that he had faced something beyond ordinary human courage. Despite commanding the largest army in history, despite achieving complete tactical victory, Xerxes had been defeated in the most important way. The Spartans had achieved something that would haunt their enemies forever. They had made dying look easy, even beautiful. That was the most terrifying victory of all. If these hidden truths about ancient warfare have captivated you, don't let this be the end of your journey into the past. Hit that like button and subscribe to uncover more secrets that history books rarely tell. The courage of the 300 wasn't born from ignorance or recklessness, but from a profound understanding of what it means to live and die with honor. What other mysteries from the ancient world would you like us to explore next? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, the greatest battles aren't always won by the largest armies, but by the warriors who refuse to compromise their principles, even in the face of certain death.